I was home alone one night, just watching ice road truckers on TV, when I heard a strange noise coming from the basement. It was like a shuffling, a faint sound that made my skin crawl. At first, I tried to brush it off as some random creak or the house settling, but it persisted, growing louder and more distinct. Curiosity mingled with unease as I grabbed a flashlight and made my way down the creaky stairs. The air was heavy, and every step felt like an echo in the silence. As I reached the bottom, I clicked on the flashlight, casting a feeble beam into the darkened space. And that's when I saw them, two figures, lurking in the shadows. My heart lurched into my throat, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. I couldn't make out their faces, but their presence alone was enough to send a shiver down my spine. Without thinking, I bolted back up the stairs, heart pounding in my chest. I slammed the basement door shut, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the lock. Panic surged through me. I was trapped, alone, with intruders in my house. I dialed 911, my fingers shaking as I tried to relay what was happening. The operator assured me that help was on the way, but those moments felt like an eternity. I could hear them downstairs, moving around, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Minutes felt like hours until I heard the distant sound of sirens approaching. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from below, followed by the sound of glass shattering. They were trying to escape. I raced downstairs, fear mingling with desperation. The basement window was broken, a jagged hole where they had made their escape. My heart sank as I realized they were getting away. The police arrived soon after, but it was too late. The intruders had vanished into the night, leaving behind an unsettling sense of violation and fear. The officers scoured the area, but there was no sign of them. I felt vulnerable, unsafe in my own home. Every creak, every sound sent a jolt of fear through me. The idea that someone had invaded my space, my sanctuary, it haunted me. I bolstered security, installed cameras, and reinforced the locks, but the sense of unease lingered. It wasn't just the physical intrusion, it was the violation of my sense of security, the feeling that nowhere was truly safe. The incident gnawed at me, a constant reminder of vulnerability. I couldn't shake off the fear that they might come back, that I might once again hear those shuffling footsteps in the dead of night. I sought solace in the company of friends, in the reassurance of familiar faces, but the memory of that night remained vivid, an unwelcome presence in the back of my mind. Weeks turned into months, and while the fear lessened, it never truly disappeared. I tried to move on, to reclaim a sense of normalcy, but the trauma of that night lingered, a reminder that danger could lurk where least expected. The police never found the intruders, and I was left with unanswered questions. I was alone, as usual, wrapping up for the day. Locking the front door, I settled behind my desk, flipping through paperwork and organizing items to list online. It was a routine evening until I heard a faint noise from the back of the shop, a shuffling, a creak that didn't belong. My heart skipped a beat, and I paused, straining my ears to listen. Maybe it was just the old building settling, I told myself, trying to brush it off. But then came the unmistakable sound of the back door being jimmied open. Fear gripped me. I was alone, vulnerable, with intruders breaking in. Adrenaline surged through me as I grabbed a heavy brass ornament from the desk, a makeshift weapon. My mind raced, every sense heightened, as I tiptoed toward the source of the noise. The shop seemed unfamiliar, cloaked in shadows that danced in the dim light. As I approached the back, I saw them, shadows moving stealthily, figures silhouetted against the faint glow from the streetlights. Panic surged. I had to protect myself, my livelihood. I confronted them, voice trembling but firm, demanding they leave. They turned, caught off guard by my presence. The air grew thick with tension, their faces partially obscured by makeshift masks. I could feel their eyes on me, cold and calculating. They were thieves, and I was in their way. For a moment, time stood still, a chilling standoff between me and these intruders. My heart raced, and I felt a surge of fear and anger. Then, one of them lunged toward me, and instinct kicked in. I swung the brass ornament, aiming to defend myself. The metallic clatter echoed in the shop as the ornament collided with the wall, missing the intruder by inches. I stumbled back, fear gripping me, realizing I was outnumbered. They were closing in, their movements predatory, as if I was prey in their hunt. Desperation consumed me. I needed help. I fumbled for my phone, fingers trembling as I dialed 911, trying to explain the situation as calmly as I could, though my voice shook with fear. Every passing second felt like an eternity, my eyes darting between the intruders and the phone, hoping for the police to arrive. But they were closing in faster than I anticipated. I backed away, trying to keep some distance between us. Adrenaline surged through me, but I knew I had to hold on until help arrived. The intruders seemed unfazed by the impending arrival of the police, their eyes fixed on me, their intentions menacing. Then, suddenly, the sound of sirens pierced the night. Relief washed over me, but the thieves didn't seem perturbed. In a swift motion, they made a break for it, darting toward the broken back door, vanishing into the darkness. The police arrived moments later, but the intruders had slipped away. They took my statement, examined the crime scene, but it felt futile. I was left shaken, standing amidst the remnants of the intrusion, my sanctuary violated, my sense of security shattered. In the aftermath, I reinforced security measures, installed stronger locks, and added cameras. But the chilling encounter lingered, a nightmare that replayed in my mind, a reminder of vulnerability in the most unexpected moments. The incident haunted me, lingering as a chilling memory that made every noise in the night a cause for alarm. I tried to push past it, to continue with life as usual, but the fear of a repeat encounter kept me on edge. The antique shop lost its warmth, its charm replaced by a constant sense of unease. I remember it vividly. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway with my wife, a much-needed break. We booked this cozy Airbnb tucked away in the countryside. The host was friendly, welcoming us with warm hospitality as we settled in. It was serene, a perfect retreat from the hustle of daily life. That night, we drifted off to sleep, the quiet of the countryside wrapping around us. But suddenly, I woke up to this sound, a faint noise that pulled me from my slumber. I glanced at the clock. It was well past midnight. I nudged my wife awake, whispering about the noise. We both listened, trying to figure out where it was coming from. Then, footsteps, faint but unmistakable, echoing from somewhere within the house. My heart started racing, this instinctual fear of someone being in our space. I grabbed a flashlight, my wife clenching my hand tightly as we cautiously made our way down the hallway. The house felt eerily still, the only sound our own breathing. We approached the source of the noise, and that's when we saw him, this shadowy figure standing in the living room. I felt this overwhelming sense of dread, this fear gripping me. I called out, demanding to know who he was, but he didn't respond. I felt this surge of panic, this realization that there was an intruder in our rental. I flicked on the lights, and there he was, this man we had spoken to when we arrived, his face etched in my memory. I couldn't comprehend it. He had seemed harmless, friendly even, when we first met. But now, Seeing him in our space in the dead of night, it felt surreal, like a nightmare unfolding. I tried to reason with him, asking why he was here, but he remained silent, this unsettling calmness about him. My wife was trembling beside me, this fear reflecting in her eyes. I felt this surge of adrenaline, this protective instinct kicking in. I urged him to leave, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. But he just stood there, this eerie stillness, his gaze fixed on us. I searched for my phone, wanting to call for help, but it was in the bedroom. I felt this overwhelming sense of vulnerability, this fear that we were at his mercy. I tried to steer my wife toward the door, this desperate need to get out, to escape. But as we moved, he blocked our path, this sudden movement that sent chills down my spine. I felt this growing panic, this realization that we were trapped. He finally spoke, his voice chillingly calm, saying something that sent shivers down my spine. I felt this overwhelming sense of danger, this dread of what he might do. I grabbed anything I could find, this makeshift attempt at self-defense, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt this sheer terror, this fight-or-flight response kicking in. I pleaded with him to let us go, this desperate attempt to reason with someone who seemed beyond reason. But he just stood there, this unsettling calmness, blocking our way out. Then, a faint sound of a car approaching outside, a glimmer of hope. I shouted for help, hoping someone would hear. He seemed startled for a moment, this flicker of hesitation. I took that chance, pushing past him, grabbing my wife's hand, and making a run for the door. I felt this adrenaline-fueled rush, this desperate need to escape. We ran outside, the cold night air hitting us, and we didn't stop until we reached the main road. I felt this overwhelming relief, this fear slowly fading as we flagged down the approaching car. The police arrived shortly after, and we told them everything. But when they checked the house, the intruder was gone, leaving no trace behind. I felt this lingering fear, this haunting memory of that horrifying experience that made us fear for our safety. It was a night of sheer terror, this chilling encounter with that man we had conversed with earlier, turning into a nightmare. This happened around 3 years ago now. See, I was used to the rhythmic lullaby of the river, the gentle rocking of my boat, a place I called home. It was a tranquil existence, being surrounded by the calming waters under the moonlit sky. But that night, everything changed. It was around 2 a.m., and I was startled awake by this unfamiliar sound, a faint thud that echoed through the quietness. My heart raced. Something wasn't right. I reached for the flashlight, this gnawing feeling of unease growing within me. I crept out of my bunk, the floorboards creaking softly under my weight. I had this sense that someone else was there, an intruder on my boat in the dead of night. I felt this surge of adrenaline, this primal instinct to protect my home. I moved cautiously, my breath shallow, trying to locate the source of the noise. Then, a faint shuffling sound, and I knew I wasn't alone. I felt this creeping fear, this realization sinking in that I was facing a dangerous situation. I turned the corner, shining the light, and there he was, this figure standing in the shadows. I felt this overwhelming sense of vulnerability, this gut-wrenching fear. I demanded to know who he was, but he just stared at me, this chilling silence. I could see this glint of something in his hand, this menacing object that sent chills down my spine. I felt this surge of panic, this realization that I was in a fight for my life. I yelled at him to leave, to get off my boat, but he just stood there, this eerie stillness about him. I felt this overwhelming sense of danger, this urgency to defend myself. He lunged at me, this sudden movement, and I reacted instinctively, dodging his attack. I felt this sheer terror, this fight or flight response kicking in. I grabbed whatever I could find, this desperate attempt at self-defense, this battle against an intruder who was determined to harm me. I felt this overwhelming surge of adrenaline, this need to survive. We grappled, this chaotic struggle on the confined space of my boat. I felt this overwhelming fear, this desperation to overpower him, to protect myself. I managed to push him back, this momentary respite that allowed me to catch my breath. I felt this overwhelming relief, this glimmer of hope. But he wasn't backing down, this relentless aggressiveness that made my heart race. I fought with every ounce of strength I had, this fight for survival in the dead of night. I could see the determination in his eyes, this relentless intent to harm me. I felt this overwhelming panic, this dread of what might happen. I managed to land a blow, this fleeting moment of advantage. I felt this surge of adrenaline, this hope that I could fend him off. But he was relentless, this menacing figure refusing to yield. I felt this overwhelming sense of being overpowered, this fear consuming me. I yelled for help, this desperate plea for anyone to hear. I felt this sheer terror, this fight against an intruder who seemed beyond reason. The struggle continued, this chaotic clash in the darkness. I felt this overwhelming sense of exhaustion, this battle that seemed endless. Then, a sudden moment of opportunity, a chance to break free. I made a run for it, this desperate escape from the danger that lurked on my boat. I reached the shore, this rush of adrenaline fueling my escape. I felt this overwhelming relief, this fear slowly ebbing away. I called for help, this urgent plea for assistance. I felt this lingering fear, this haunting memory of that horrifying encounter that shook my peaceful existence. I've been babysitting for the Williams family for a fair few months now. They're a wealthy bunch, and their house is like something out of a magazine, big, spacious, and honestly, a bit intimidating. But the kids are sweet, and it's good money, so I can't complain. Tonight was just like any other night. The kids were in bed, and I was chilling in the living room, just flicking through a magazine. That's when I heard a creaking sound that wasn't supposed to be there. I brushed it off at first, thinking it might be the house settling or something. But then I heard it again, this time more distinct, like footsteps. My heart started racing. I knew those weren't normal house sounds. I crept down the hall, my pulse pounding in my ears. The house felt too big, too quiet. I peered into the dark, trying to make out shapes in the shadows. That's when I saw him, this figure moving around in the living room. My blood ran cold. This wasn't right. I was supposed to be alone in the house. I felt this surge of panic, this fight or flight instinct kicking in. I needed to protect the kids, to get them to safety. I bolted back to their rooms, this urgency guiding my steps. I grabbed the kids, trying to keep my voice steady, trying not to let the fear show. I whispered urgently, telling them we needed to hide, to go to the safe room. They looked scared, but they listened, this trust in me that I couldn't let down. We made a dash for the safe room, this little fortress tucked away in the house. I could hear him, this intruder, moving closer. My heart was pounding, my palms sweating. We managed to get inside, locking the door behind us. I felt this overwhelming relief, this momentary sense of safety. But then the reality hit me. We were trapped in this room, waiting for whoever was out there to leave. The kids were scared, huddling together, their eyes wide with fear. I tried to calm them down, telling them it was going to be okay, but I wasn't sure myself. I could hear him moving around outside the safe room, this eerie silence broken only by the sound of his footsteps. I felt this overwhelming sense of vulnerability, this fear that he might find us. I searched for anything we could use, something to defend ourselves if he got in. But the room was sparse, just a few supplies and no real means of protection. I felt this sheer terror, this helplessness of not being able to do much. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly, each second feeling like an eternity. I tried to keep the kids calm, to distract them from the danger lurking outside. But I could see the fear in their eyes, this shared dread that hung heavy in the air. We huddled in silence, waiting, hoping for this nightmare to end. I felt this overwhelming sense of responsibility, this need to keep the kids safe no matter what. I tried to listen for any signs that he was gone, any sound that would signal safety. But it was just this suffocating silence, this uncertainty that gnawed at me. Then, after what felt like hours, the house was finally quiet. I waited a little longer, just to be sure, before slowly opening the door. I peeked outside, making sure it was clear before guiding the kids out. We made our way downstairs, cautiously checking every room. The intruder was gone, leaving behind this chilling sense of violation. I felt this overwhelming relief, this gratitude that we were safe. I called the police, telling them what happened. They arrived quickly, searching the house and the surroundings. But there was no sign of the intruder. It was like he vanished into thin air. It was a night of sheer terror. I've lived in this house for donkey's years, and it's always been my safe haven. But one night, everything changed. I was just watching TV, winding down after a long day, when I heard this noise coming from downstairs. It was a thud, something heavy. My heart raced. I knew it wasn't normal. I tiptoed down the stairs, trying to brush it off as maybe something falling or the house settling. But then I saw him, this figure in a mask, standing right there in my living room. My heart skipped a beat. This was no accident. I felt this wave of fear, this realization sinking in that someone was in my house, someone who shouldn't be there. But it wasn't just any burglar. There was something different about him, something chilling. I tried to make a run for it, to call the police, but he was fast. He grabbed me, this tight grip that sent shivers down my spine. I felt this overwhelming sense of terror, this panic taking over. He whispered something, this eerie tone that made my blood run cold. His intentions weren't about stealing, they were far more sinister. I felt this overwhelming dread, this fear of what he might do. He forced me into the living room, this menacing presence that made my skin crawl. I begged him to leave, to take whatever he wanted and go, but his intentions were clear, this malevolent glint in his eyes. He had this plan, this twisted agenda that I couldn't understand. I tried to reason with him, to make him see that this wasn't what he wanted, but he didn't listen. I felt this sheer helplessness, this realization that I was at his mercy. I tried to break free, to fight back, but he was stronger. I felt this overwhelming sense of being overpowered, this struggle that seemed futile. He had this cold determination, this intent that made me shudder. I knew I had to do something, to find a way out of this nightmare. I managed to grab something nearby, this desperate attempt at self-defense. I swung at him, this fight for my life, but he dodged it with this chilling ease. He cornered me, this menacing figure that seemed unstoppable. I felt this overwhelming terror, this dread of what might happen next. I screamed for help, this desperate plea for anyone to hear. But it was just me and him, this chilling standoff that seemed to stretch on endlessly. He had this twisted pleasure, this sadistic enjoyment that made my blood run cold. I knew I had to find a way out, to escape this nightmare. I saw a chance, this fleeting moment of opportunity, and I took it. I made a run for it, this desperate dash for freedom, not knowing what lay ahead. I reached the door, this surge of adrenaline fueling my escape. I didn't look back, I just ran, this fear urging me to get as far away as I could. I called the police, telling them what happened. They arrived quickly, searching the house, but he was gone, leaving behind this lingering dread. I was just about to hit the sack when I heard this noise downstairs. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct enough to make me freeze. I grabbed a baseball bat and slowly made my way downstairs, trying to stay quiet. That's when I saw her, this woman, standing in my living room. I didn't recognize her. I had never seen her before. Panic surged through me. This wasn't just some random break-in. I tried to make sense of it, to figure out what she wanted, but she just stood there, this eerie stillness that sent chills down my spine. I could see this glint in her eyes, this obsession that made my blood run cold. I tried to reason with her, to ask her why she was here, but she didn't respond. She just stared at me, this unsettling gaze that seemed to pierce through me. I tried to call the police, but she lunged at me, this sudden movement that startled me. I managed to dodge her, this adrenaline fueling my survival instinct. I tried to keep her at bay, to find a way out, but she was relentless. She had this fervor, this obsession that was beyond reason. I felt this overwhelming sense of fear, this dread of what she might do. I tried to reason with her again, to make her see that this wasn't right, but she wasn't listening. She had this fixation on me that seemed unshakable. I made a dash for the door, trying to escape, but she blocked my way. I felt this sheer terror, this realization that I was trapped in my own home with this intruder. I tried to find anything I could use as a weapon, something to defend myself, but she was too close. I swung the bat, trying to keep her away, but she dodged it with this eerie agility. I felt this overwhelming sense of being overpowered, this fight for my life that seemed futile. She had this manic determination, this intent that sent shivers down my spine. I screamed for help, this desperate plea for anyone to hear, but it was just me and her in this chilling standoff. I felt this suffocating fear, this panic that threatened to consume me. I managed to get to the phone, this hope that maybe I could call for help, but she grabbed it from me, cutting off any chance of reaching out. I felt this overwhelming sense of despair, this realization that I was alone in this nightmare. I tried to reason with her one last time, to plead for my safety, but she just stared at me, this haunting gaze that filled me with dread. I saw a window of opportunity, this fleeting chance to escape, and I took it. I made a run for it, this adrenaline pushing me to get away, to find safety. I managed to get out, this relief washing over me, but I knew she was still inside. I called the police, telling them what happened. They arrived and searched the place, but she was gone, but later arrested. I've always felt safe in my home, nestled in a quiet neighborhood. But one evening, things took a terrifying turn. I was just settling in for the night, catching up on some work, when I heard this commotion outside. At first, I dismissed it as maybe just some kids playing around or neighbors being rowdy. But then, the noise got louder, more frantic. My instincts told me something wasn't right. I peeked through the curtains, and that's when I saw him, this man I'd never seen before, trying to force his way in. My heart pounded in my chest. Fear gripped me as I watched him, this stranger, this intruder, trying to break through my front door. I scrambled to lock all the doors and windows, trying to keep him out. I could hear him yelling, this aggressive tone that made my blood run cold. I called the police, trembling as I explained the situation. I was on my own, this terrifying realization sinking in that it was just me and this man trying to get into my home. I was overcome with this fear, this feeling of vulnerability. I kept thinking, what if he gets in? What will he do? I felt this overwhelming sense of panic, this sheer desperation for help. I could hear him banging on the door, this relentless pounding that echoed through the house. I felt this surge of adrenaline, this fight or flight response kicking in. I searched for anything I could use to defend myself, to protect my home, but I was shaking so much that I could barely think straight. I felt this intense dread, this fear of what might happen next. The minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police to arrive. I could see him through the window, this man, this stranger, still trying to break in. His persistence was chilling, this determination that made me feel trapped. I heard sirens in the distance, this wave of relief washing over me. But then, he stopped. He turned and disappeared into the darkness. I couldn't shake off this feeling of terror, this fear that he might come back. I've always enjoyed the peace of my little lake cabin. It's been my getaway, my sanctuary. It was at the end of my garden backing onto the lake. I would read and relax in there all the time. I decided to rent out the cabin to help with the bills. I put a bed in there and everything someone would need to stay there. I found someone who responded to my ad in the paper, and he seemed like a decent tenant. He moved in 4 months ago, a quiet man who kept to himself. Everything changed one night. It was late, and I was just about to turn in when I heard this noise, this eerie scraping sound coming from the back of the house. My heart started racing. I hesitated for a moment, but I knew I had to check it out. I made my way through the house, cautiously stepping towards the back. As I reached the kitchen, I saw him through the window, this tenant, this man who had been living in my cabin. He was trying to force his way into the house. Panic washed over me as I realized what was happening. I rushed to lock all the doors and windows, but he was persistent. I could see him, this eerie silhouette in the darkness, trying to get in. I grabbed my phone, fingers trembling as I dialed 911. My voice shook as I explained the situation to the dispatcher. I was terrified, this overwhelming sense of vulnerability. I felt this surge of fear as I saw him at the back door, pounding on it relentlessly. He was shouting, saying things that sent shivers down my spine. I felt this chill run through me, this terror of being alone with this intruder. I searched for something, anything to protect myself, but my mind was racing, clouded by fear. I felt this sheer panic, this realization that I was facing an intruder in my own home. The minutes dragged on as I waited for help to arrive. I could hear him, this relentless banging on the door, this haunting echo that filled the house. I felt this overwhelming sense of dread, this fear of what he might do if he got in. I heard sirens approaching in the distance. But then, he stopped. The pounding ceased, and there was this eerie silence. I didn't know what to expect next. The police arrived, searching the property, but he was nowhere to be found. I felt this mix of relief and fear. I never saw him again after that, and it's safe to say I don't rent out my lake cabin anymore. Living alone in a quiet neighborhood always gave me a sense of security, until that one night when everything turned into a nightmare. It was late. I was getting ready for bed, the usual routine. But then I heard this noise downstairs, something that made me freeze. Footsteps, faint yet distinct, echoing through the house. My heart pounded, my breath hitched. I grabbed the closest thing I could use as a makeshift weapon and crept downstairs, trying to stay as silent as possible. As I reached the bottom step, I saw her, a woman I'd never seen before, standing in my living room. My mind raced. I asked her who she was, why she was in my house. She seemed panicked, frightened, claiming she was running from someone dangerous. I felt this pang of empathy, this urge to help, but something about her demeanor made me uneasy. She kept pleading for help, but her eyes, they held this intense desperation, this hint of something sinister beneath the surface. I tried to reason with her, to call the police, but she grew agitated, insisting I couldn't involve them. I felt this chill down my spine, this realization that her presence was a threat. I knew I had to get her out, to protect myself and my home. I tried to keep calm, to coax her towards the door, promising to help, but she resisted. She started pacing, this frenzied energy that made the air tense. I could feel this rising sense of danger, this feeling that things were spiraling out of control. I didn't know what to do. I was trapped with this stranger in my own home. I made a move towards the phone, hoping to call for help, but she lunged at me. Panic surged through me as we struggled, this chaotic fight to defend myself. I felt this rush of adrenaline, this overwhelming fear. She was stronger than I expected, this fierce determination in her eyes as she tried to overpower me. I fought back, this desperate struggle to break free, to escape the danger she brought into my home. I managed to push her away and dashed for the door, this overwhelming need to get away from her. I ran out into the night, shaking, gasping for breath. I didn't look back until I was sure I was safe, far away from the house. I called the police, my voice trembling as I explained what happened. It was a night I wouldn't forget. I'd always been cautious about security, double-checking locks, feeling safe in my own home. That illusion shattered one evening. I was alone, doing some work when I heard a knock. I opened the door, and there he was, this seemingly charming guy claiming he needed help. His charisma disarmed me, his story about car trouble and needing to use a phone seemed plausible. I let him in, unaware of the danger brewing behind his smile. He was charming, engaging in conversation, and I felt this strange sense of comfort around him. As he used the phone, I sensed something off, this feeling gnawing at me, but I pushed it aside. He thanked me, said he owed me one, and left. I shrugged off the unease, thinking it was just my nerves. Later that night, I heard noises outside. I went to check and found him standing there, this unsettling grin on his face. My heart raced. I demanded to know why he was back. He turned on the charm, playing it off like he was just passing by. I felt this chill, this realization that he wasn't just some stranded guy. He was here for something more, something sinister. I tried to tell him to leave, but he persisted, weaving this manipulative narrative, trying to gain my trust. I tried to stand my ground, but he was persuasive, convincing. He seemed harmless, but I couldn't shake off this feeling of impending danger. I felt this growing sense of dread, this fear of what he might do. He kept finding reasons to linger, to stay, and I felt this helplessness, this fear of being alone with someone whose intentions were unclear. I tried to remain composed, to mask my unease, but it was getting harder. As the night wore on, he became more insistent, more invasive. He moved closer, invading my personal space, and I felt this rising panic, this urgency to get him out. but he wouldn't budge. He had this unsettling persistence. I tried to call for help, but he snatched the phone away, this sudden aggression that sent shivers down my spine. I felt this surge of fear, this realization that I was trapped, alone with this manipulative intruder. He cornered me, this menacing aura that surrounded him. I felt this overwhelming sense of danger, this primal fear. I knew I had to get away, to escape his grip. I pushed past him and ran, this sheer terror driving me to flee. I locked myself in a room, shaking, trying to call for help again. I felt this mix of panic and anger, this fear that consumed me. I didn't know what he was capable of. I didn't want to find out. I found myself in this surreal situation one evening. I had just returned home, ready to unwind after a long day's work. The door creaked open, and that's when I saw her, a neighbor from down the street, standing in my hallway. My initial reaction was shock. What was she doing here? I barely knew her, just those casual nods in passing. She looked distressed, distraught even, her eyes wide with some kind of fear. She rambled about needing help, saying something about danger lurking outside. Her distress was palpable, her words coming out in a panicked rush. I didn't quite understand what was going on, but her fear was contagious. Without thinking much, I invited her in, asking her to calm down, trying to understand what she was so afraid of. She started speaking in fragments, her sentences incomplete, and I couldn't grasp the whole picture. But as she paced around my living room, I began to feel this unease settling in. Her behavior was erratic, this sense of unpredictability that made me nervous. She kept glancing out the window, muttering about someone following her. I tried to reason with her, to calm her nerves, but she seemed beyond reason. Her presence made my home feel unsafe, this intruder who had barged in with her distress and chaos. I suggested calling the police, hoping they could assist her, but she became frantic, pleading for me not to involve anyone else. Her desperation was unsettling, raising alarms within me. As I contemplated my options, her behavior grew more erratic. She paced faster, her voice rising, and she started rummaging through things, as if searching for something desperately. It was all happening so fast, this sudden intrusion into my safe haven. I attempted to coax her to sit down, to talk, but she wouldn't listen. Her eyes were fixated on something unseen, her words becoming incoherent, and I felt this chill, this fear that something was deeply wrong. I didn't know what to do. I was torn between helping her and protecting myself. The atmosphere was charged with tension, this sense of impending danger hanging in the air. Suddenly, she froze, her eyes wide in terror. I followed her gaze to the window, and that's when I saw a figure lurking in the shadows. Fear gripped me as I realized she wasn't lying. Someone was out there, watching us. My heart raced, and I rushed to secure the doors and windows, trying to keep us safe. But the tension inside was unbearable. She kept muttering, almost chanting, her fear contagious, infecting the room. I wanted to believe her distress was genuine, but her behavior was erratic, unpredictable. It was like she was trapped in her own nightmare, and I was caught in it too. Minutes felt like hours as we waited in that tense silence, listening for any sign of the intruder outside. Every creak, every rustle outside sent shivers down my spine. Eventually, the noises ceased, the lurking figure vanished. But the sense of dread lingered. I didn't know what to make of the situation, this bizarre encounter with a neighbor who had invaded my home, bringing her distress and fear with her. As she finally calmed down, I gently suggested she go back to our own home, promising to check in with her later. I watched her leave, feeling some relief. The incident had left me with a disturbing sense of vulnerability in my own home. I remember that night like it was carved into my bones. The moon was barely a sliver in the sky, casting eerie shadows across the yard. I was home alone, just me in the quiet of the night, when I heard something strange outside. At first, I brushed it off as the wind or some neighborhood noise, but it grew louder, more persistent. That's when I noticed them, dark figures lingering at the edge of my property. Fear wrapped around me like a vice. My heart pounded in my chest. I hurried to lock all the doors and windows, feeling this primal need to keep whatever was out there away from me. But they weren't content just lurking. Their voices carried through the night, demanding entry, their words dripping with menace. I froze, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I never thought I'd have to confront something like this, a group of strangers intent on invading my home. They banged on the door, their fists thudding against the wood like a threat. I could hear their shouts, their demands growing more aggressive. Panic clawed at my chest as I searched for anything to defend myself, to protect my sanctuary. I tried to reason with them through the door, pleading for them to leave. But they were relentless, their words harsh, their intentions clear. They wanted to break in, and they weren't taking no for an answer. The situation escalated quickly. I could hear them jostling, attempting to force their way in. My heart raced, and I dialed emergency services, my voice trembling as I described the nightmare unfolding at my doorstep. Time slowed to a crawl as I waited for help, each passing second feeling like an eternity. Then, a loud crash shattered the night. They had broken through. Fear gripped me like never before. I was paralyzed, trapped in my own home with these strangers who meant me harm. They barged in, and chaos erupted. I was outnumbered, their aggression palpable. Their intentions were clear now, to overpower me, to gain control. I felt the weight of their violence as they pushed past me, ransacking my sanctuary, my safe space. I fought back, desperately trying to protect myself, my home. It was a primal instinct, survival kicking in. But against their numbers, against their brute force, I felt helpless. I could hear things crashing, their shouts echoing through the house. Fear and anger surged within me, this violation of my space and my safety driving me to push back with everything I had. I tried to find an escape route, a way out of this nightmare, but they had cornered me. The air crackled with tension, with fear and desperation. There was no reasoning with them. They were set on their course. I managed to grab something, anything, to defend myself. It was a terrifying dance, this struggle between survival and surrender. The adrenaline surged, and I fought tooth and nail, trying to keep them at bay, to protect what was mine. I don't know how long it lasted, this harrowing battle. It felt like an eternity, every moment etched with fear and uncertainty. I lost track of time, lost track of the chaos and the noise, just focusing on staying alive. But then, blessed relief arrived. I heard the distant sirens, the cavalry rushing in to save the day. Their arrival was like a lifeline, a beacon of hope in the darkness. The intruders must have heard it too, because suddenly they scattered, fleeing into the night like shadows. Their presence lingered in the shattered remnants of my home, a haunting reminder of the horror that had just unfolded. The police arrived, their voices calm and reassuring as they checked on me, trying to piece together what had happened. The house was a mess, my sanctuary turned upside down. But I was alive, shaken to the core but alive. As the adrenaline subsided, I felt the full weight of the terror settle in. I had lost count of the nights I spent parked at the same spot, hunkered down in my camper van. It wasn't where I'd imagined myself, but life has its twists. I was there because I'd been evicted, plain and simple. The van was my temporary refuge, my tiny sanctuary on wheels. That night felt like any other, quiet, still. I was trying to drift off to sleep, the soft hum of the city in the background. But then, a sound cut through the silence. It was subtle at first, just a slight shuffle nearby. I brushed it off, attributing it to the usual city noises, but it persisted, growing louder and more distinct. I froze, that sinking feeling twisting in my gut. I strained to listen, my senses on high alert. My heart quickened, my breath shallow as the noise continued, drawing closer. I peered out the window, scanning the dark surroundings, trying to make sense of the shapes in the dim light. And that's when I saw it, a figure, hunched and furtive, lurking near my van. Dread clenched in my chest. Fear rushed through me like a tidal wave. Who was this? What did they want? My mind raced through the possibilities, none of them good. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it could be just someone passing by, but my gut told me otherwise. The figure wasn't moving away, it was edging closer, a shadow in the night. I reached for the small flashlight I kept nearby, my hands trembling. With a deep breath, I flicked it on, casting a weak beam of light into the darkness outside. The sight made my blood run cold. There, illuminated in that faint glow, was a person, face obscured by a hoodie, inching closer to my van. Panic surged through me. What did they want from me? Why here? Why now? I fumbled to lock the van, every sound outside amplifying my terror. I was stuck, a sitting duck in this confined space, no exit strategy, no way to know what was coming next. The figure reached the van, their silhouette lurking just outside my window. I held my breath, heart hammering in my chest. And then, a soft tap on the glass, barely audible but loud in the stillness of the night. The dread was suffocating. I couldn't bring myself to look, to meet whoever was out there. But curiosity mingled with fear, and against my better judgment, I turned to look. Our eyes met through the glass, and I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something off about this person, something unsettling in their gaze. They didn't seem right, no sense of familiarity, just a stranger with an intent that I couldn't discern. I braced myself for the worst, trying to think of a plan, an escape. The figure lingered for a few moments longer, their gaze drilling into mine, before finally turning away. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. I was still on edge, my senses heightened, waiting for what might come next. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe too loudly, afraid that any sound might draw them back. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, the silence outside heavy and oppressive. My mind raced, running through scenarios, trying to figure out what to do next. Should I call for help? Should I try to drive away? But the figure was gone, vanished into the night. I stayed frozen in place, the encounter burned into my mind, my heart still pounding in my chest. The fear lingered, hanging heavy in the air, the knowledge that the night might not be over. I didn't sleep that night, kept vigil in my van, every sound sending shivers down my spine. When dawn finally broke, I breathed a hesitant sigh of relief. It was a regular evening, nothing out of the ordinary. I was at home, just unwinding after a long day, the quietness of my place a welcome respite. But then, a sound. A noise so subtle it almost went unnoticed, like a soft tap on my door. I hesitated, puzzled by the intrusion. Who could it be at this hour? I crept over, trying to stay quiet, and peeked through the peephole. A woman stood there, a stranger. She looked harmless, just an average person. My initial instinct was to ignore it, but something nagged at me, urging me to open the door. I shouldn't have. She claimed to be someone else, a neighbor who lived a few houses down. Her story seemed off, but she was persuasive, desperate even. She needed help, she said. That was her tale. But I couldn't shake this feeling that something was wrong. Against my better judgment, I let her in. Her demeanor changed, subtle, but enough to raise the hairs on the back of my neck. I tried to brush off the unease, to offer her the benefit of the doubt. But her eyes, there was something in them, a glint of darkness beneath the surface. She spoke of danger, of being followed, her voice trembling with what seemed like fear. I tried to be empathetic, reassuring her that she was safe with me. But inside, an alarm bell was ringing. I didn't trust her. As the night wore on, her behavior became increasingly erratic. She'd pace around, mumbling to herself, her presence suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't who she claimed to be. Things took a turn when she asked for access to my phone, pleading that she needed to make a call. Against my better judgment, I handed it over. That was my mistake. She made the call, but the conversation was cryptic. Her eyes darted to mine, a chilling look that conveyed a hidden message. Panic set in. Who was she talking to? What had I gotten myself into? I knew I had to get her out, but she refused to leave. Her demeanor changed once more, turning hostile, and she blocked the door, preventing my escape. I was trapped in my own home. My sanctuary turned into a prison. Desperation gnawed at me, my mind racing for an escape plan. I tried reasoning with her, but she was unyielding, her intentions growing clearer by the minute. I pretended to comply, offering her something to eat, anything to buy time. But the atmosphere crackled with tension. She was up to something, and I feared what it might be. I made a bold move, faking a phone call to the police, hoping it would scare her off. But she saw through it, her eyes narrowed in on me. The mask had slipped, revealing a malevolent side, a predator hiding in plain sight. She lunged at me, a sudden burst of aggression, and I stumbled backward, barely dodging her grasp. My heart raced, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I had to act fast. I made a dash for the front door, but she was faster, blocking my path. Fear gripped me. I was staring into the eyes of someone who had no intention of letting me go. She wasn't here for refuge. She was here for something much more sinister. I scrambled for any means of defense, grabbing whatever I could find within reach, a heavy object, a makeshift weapon. I held it up, trying to fend her off, trying to buy myself some time. Our struggle echoed through the house, the chaotic fight for survival. She was relentless, fueled by an unknown motivation, and I was fighting to protect myself and my own home. I managed to break free for a moment, bolting towards a window. With a forceful crash, I shattered it, aiming to escape, to scream for help. But before I could, she lunged at me again, dragging me back into the darkness of the house. The night stretched on, a terrifying ordeal, each moment testing my resolve, my will to survive. I couldn't let her win, couldn't let her take control. But she was cunning, unpredictable, an intruder in every sense of the word. In the end, sheer desperation gave me the strength to break away. I made a run for it, out into the street, shouting for help as I went. The night air felt like freedom, the distant sound of sirens my salvation. I didn't look back until I was safe, the police arriving just in time. They detained her, but the horror of that night stayed with me, a a stark reminder of how easily danger can enter our lives, how quickly the line between safety and peril can blur. She was gone, but her presence stayed in my mind. I was just settling into the calm of my home, the quietness of the evening, a comforting routine. But then, a faint sound, almost like a whisper. I couldn't place it at first, a gentle creaking that seemed out of place. Then the realization struck: it was the front door. I approached cautiously, trying to brush off the unease, telling myself it might just be the wind. But as I got closer, my heart pounded in my chest. The door was slightly ajar, the lock tampered with. Dread clutched at my throat. Someone had forced their way in. I didn't need to guess who it might be. The breakup with my ex-boyfriend hadn't ended on good terms. He hadn't taken it well. Angry calls, aggressive messages, I blocked him from every contact point, but here he was, invading my sanctuary. I thought of calling the police, but instinct told me time was not on my side. Panic set in as I realized I hadn't locked the back door. I rushed, trying to secure it, but it was too late. He was already inside. The familiarity of his presence sent a shiver down my spine. His eyes, once warm, were now filled with malice, a darkness that wasn't there before. There was no reasoning with him. He was consumed by something sinister. He demanded answers, answers I couldn't give. He was determined, fueled by vengeance, his demeanor twisted with a mix of anger and hurt. His words were venomous, laced with threats that cut through the air like a knife. I tried to reason, to calm him down, but it only fueled his rage. He was beyond reason. He wanted revenge, to make me pay for what he perceived as betrayal. His intentions turned malicious, and my home became a battleground. I fled to the safety of my room, locking the door behind me. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, desperate for help. But there was silence. The realization hit hard: I was alone in this. He wasn't far behind, pounding on the door, his voice escalating into screams. Fear choked me as he threatened to break through. I searched for an escape route, a way out of this nightmare. The window. It was my only chance. I opened it, the cold night air biting against my skin. But before I could make my move, he barged in, fueled by a relentless fury. I felt helpless, cornered in my own home. I had to fight. My survival instincts kicked in. I grabbed anything I could find: a lamp, a heavy object, anything to fend him off. The struggle was chaotic, desperate. I fought with every ounce of strength I had, but he was relentless. Adrenaline coursed through me as we grappled, the room a whirlwind of chaos. But he was overpowering, his rage giving him a strength I couldn't match. I was losing ground, losing hope. A moment of opportunity arose, a split-second chance. I bolted, pushing past him, racing towards the front door. I didn't look back, didn't dare to. I just ran, sprinting into the night, my lungs burning. I didn't stop until I was far away, until I saw the flashing lights of the police cars approaching. They found him, apprehended him, but the terror of that night lingered, a haunting reminder of how swiftly safety can shatter. I was away with my wife for a peaceful weekend at a quaint hotel. The room had a warm ambience, the kind that makes you forget the world outside. We were cozied up, basking in the serenity of the moment, when an unsettling feeling crept in. At first, it was a small thing, just a flicker in the corner of my eye. I brushed it off as tiredness, but the unease grew. The door creaked slightly, and I knew, with a sinking heart, that it wasn't the wind. We hadn't locked it. The pause before pushing the door open felt like an eternity. My wife's eyes whitened, mirroring the fear reflected in mine. A silhouette stood in the doorway, a stranger, an intruder in our space. We were paralyzed, caught in a nightmare. The man was haggard, disheveled, his eyes void of emotion. He muttered fragmented sentences, something about needing help. But his presence oozed danger, an instinctual warning that chilled us to the bone. I stepped in front of my wife, shielding her, trying to reason with him. He was jittery, erratic, and my words seemed to bounce off him. He didn't want help, he wanted something else. Something sinister. In a flash, his demeanor shifted. His plea turned into a demand, his eyes locking onto my wife. I saw the danger in that gaze, a threat that screamed louder than words ever could. Panic surged within me, a primal urge to protect her at all costs. I tried to steer him away, to buy us time, but he was unrelenting. He lunged forward, and a frenzied struggle ensued. My wife screamed, the sound cutting through the chaos. I fought with all my might, desperation lending me strength. The hotel room became a battleground, a whirlwind of fear and adrenaline. We grappled, the struggle intensifying, the air thick with tension. Furniture toppled, the noise echoing through the corridors. But in that frantic struggle, hope felt distant. The fight raged on, the intruder's intentions growing clearer with every passing second. My heart raced, my breaths came in gasps. I had to get him out, had to protect her. But he was unyielding, his strength surprising for someone so disheveled. It felt like an eternity, a desperate tug-of-war between survival and danger. A final surge of energy fueled my push, sending him stumbling out into the hallway. I slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. Adrenaline surged as I checked on my wife, making sure she was unharmed. The relief was overwhelming, but it was short-lived. Sirens blared in the distance, a testament to the chaos that had unfolded. The police arrived swiftly, taking control of the situation. They apprehended him, but the encounter haunted us. The sense of safety we had known was shattered, replaced by a haunting realization of vulnerability. The trauma lingered, leaving scars that ran deeper than the surface. The hotel room, once a sanctuary, now bore the scars of the night, a battleground where we fought against the unthinkable. We left, shaken to the core, forever changed by the chilling encounter. I was in my zone, reading a book when a knock on the door pierced the silence. I wasn't expecting anyone, especially not at this hour. Curiosity tugged at me, a cautious peep through the peephole revealing a man, clad in a neatly pressed suit. His smile seemed rehearsed, a salesman's smile. I hesitated, unsure why a salesman would show up so late. His persistence was unsettling. I cracked the door open, politely declining whatever he was peddling. But he pushed back, insistent, trying to force his way in. Fear began to bubble within me. My polite refusals escalated to firm rejections. He didn't take the hint, his demeanor shifting from overly friendly to unnervingly aggressive. My heart raced, adrenaline fueling my instincts. I closed the door with a firm slam, bolting it shut. The salesman's persistence turned menacing. He hammered on the door, demanding entry, his tone growing darker with each passing second. Panic seized me, my mind racing through options. I fumbled for my phone, fingers trembling as I dialed emergency services. The thuds against the door echoed through the house, his words a cacophony of threats and insistence. The operator's voice on the other end offered solace, but the fear was palpable. I could sense his presence on the other side of that door, his forcefulness unwavering. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, each thud against the door sending shivers down my spine. The sound of sirens in the distance offered a glimmer of hope, a lifeline in the darkness. But he didn't stop. He persisted, his attempts to gain entry growing more desperate. The arrival of the police was a relief, their presence a beacon of safety. But the salesman, undeterred, continued his onslaught against the door. The officers' voices outside tried to reason with him, but he refused to yield. The standoff felt endless, a terrifying game of endurance. My home, my sanctuary, was no longer safe. The salesman's aggressive persistence was unyielding, a nightmare unfolding right at my doorstep. The police's efforts finally prevailed, his arrest offering a semblance of closure. But the fear lingered, the intrusion seared into my memory. The salesman's face, contorted with anger, haunted my thoughts long after he was taken away. The encounter left an indelible mark, a terror that lingered within the walls of my home. I sought solace in security measures, but the sense of violation remained, a constant reminder of that harrowing night. It was a chilling encounter that changed the way I viewed safety, leaving me forever on edge, wary of the unexpected. It was just a regular evening at home, my housemate and I winding down after a long day. The familiar creaks of the house echoed through the quiet, creating an almost comforting ambience. We were engrossed in our own activities when an unusual sound broke the peace. A soft shuffle, almost indistinguishable, cut through the silence. We exchanged glances, a silent acknowledgement that we both heard it. Dismissing it initially as the settling of the house, we tried to go back to our routines. But then came another sound, clearer this time, like a footstep on the wooden floor. The unease started to seep in, a creeping sensation that something wasn't right. Our house was usually quiet at this hour, and every little noise seemed amplified. We exchanged concerned looks, a silent conversation questioning the source of the disturbance. My heart pounded in my chest as I motioned for my housemate to follow me, inching cautiously toward the source of the sound. It felt like a scene out of a suspense movie, the fear rising with every step closer. Then, a chilling realization hit us. The door that we were sure we'd locked was now slightly ajar. Panic surged through me, the reality sinking in that someone was inside our supposedly secure home. The feeling was suffocating, a blend of fear and helplessness. We moved silently, desperately trying to stay out of sight, even as the sounds of movement grew closer. There, in the dimly lit hallway, we caught a glimpse of an unfamiliar figure, a shadowy silhouette moving stealthily. The sight sent shivers down my spine, a mix of dread and disbelief. Fear constricted my throat, rendering me unable to voice the terror that gripped us. My housemate and I exchanged panicked glances, silently communicating our next move. We had to act fast, to secure ourselves, to protect each other. Our thoughts were a jumble of fear and strategy, racing against time. We had no idea who this intruder was or what their intentions were. Every move felt perilous, the adrenaline-fueled urgency guiding our actions. We retreated to a room, locking the door behind us, hoping it would provide sanctuary. The minutes felt agonizingly long, the sound of our erratic heartbeats the only audible noise in the room. We whispered reassurances to each other, trying to quell the rising panic. But the silence outside our refuge was ominous, the absence of any sound only heightening our terror. Minutes turned into what felt like hours, the tension unbearable. Every little noise, every creak outside the door, sent us into a heightened state of alertness. We strained to listen, the dread of the unknown engulfing us. The fear was all-consuming, a palpable force that enveloped the room. We waited in silence, each second stretching the limits of our endurance. The uncertainty of the intruder's motives loomed over us, a constant reminder of the danger lurking just beyond that door. It felt like an eternity before we heard distant sirens, a sound that brought both relief and apprehension. Help was on its way, but until then, we remained trapped in a tense standoff with the intruder. Finally, the arrival of the authorities shattered the tense silence. The sound of footsteps and urgent voices filled the air, a symphony of hope amidst the chaos. With cautious steps, the police investigated, ensuring the safety of our home. The intruder was apprehended, but the trauma lingered long after the authorities left. The invasion of our home, the violation of our safety, left an indelible mark on our minds. I was tidying up the cafe, like I do every night. It's usually quiet, peaceful even. The gentle hum of the espresso machine shutting down was the signal for me to start cleaning up. The place was nearly empty, just a few tables to wipe down, and I'd be done for the night. As I was going about my usual routine, I heard a sound that didn't belong. A creak, as if a floorboard was stepped on. My heart skipped a beat, but I chalked it up to the old building settling. Still, I couldn't shake off the uneasiness that had settled in. Then, another noise, distinct and unsettling this time. It sounded like a faint shuffle coming from the kitchen, where I was certain nobody else was supposed to be. My grip tightened around the cleaning cloth as I hesitated, torn between investigating and the fear of the unknown. The cafe's atmosphere felt different, heavy even. Every shadow seemed darker, every sound louder. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread, convincing myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Summoning up all the courage I had, I made my way to the kitchen, treading cautiously. The usual comforting aroma of baking pastries was replaced by an eerie silence. My footsteps sounded unnaturally loud against the tiled floor. I peered into the dimly lit kitchen, expecting to find it empty. But there, in the faint glow, I caught sight of a silhouette, a figure hunched over something. My breath hitched, and my body froze in fear. I hadn't anticipated this encounter, and I was gripped by a bone-chilling sense of vulnerability. The intruder seemed oblivious to my presence, and a surge of adrenaline propelled me into action. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone, fingers fumbling to dial for help without making a sound. My heart pounded furiously in my chest, the silence around me deafening. I held my breath, fearful that the smallest noise might draw attention to my presence. The seconds felt like an eternity, every tick of the clock echoing in my ears. The figure moved suddenly, a slight shift in its position that sent a shiver down my spine. I felt exposed, like the darkness was closing in around me. The adrenaline rush was overwhelming, and I was teetering on the edge of panic. I needed to leave, to get out of this unsettling situation. But my path was blocked, and the fear of alerting the intruder paralyzed me. My mind raced, concocting escape plans, but none seemed plausible in that moment of sheer terror. I weighed my options, contemplating making a run for the door. But before I could make a move, the figure turned, its gaze locking with mine. The feeling of being caught sent a jolt of raw fear coursing through my veins. We stood frozen, locked in a spine-chilling stare-down. The intruder's eyes seemed devoid of any emotion, a blankness that sent shivers down my spine. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like a trapped animal. I summoned all the courage I had left and made a desperate attempt to flee, but my legs felt like lead, refusing to budge. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving me paralyzed by fear. Suddenly, the intruder spoke, a voice that cut through the silence like a blade. It was a voice I didn't recognize, cold and detached. The words were chilling, sending a wave of terror crashing over me. The fear was consuming, a primal instinct to survive. I tried to reason, to negotiate, but the intruder's intentions were shrouded in malevolence. With trembling hands, I reached for anything within reach, ready to defend myself if necessary. The adrenaline surged once more, heightening my senses, but I felt utterly helpless. In a moment of sheer desperation, I let out a piercing scream, hoping against hope that someone, anyone, would hear me. But the sound seemed swallowed by the emptiness of the night. The intruder made a move, a menacing step toward me. It felt like a nightmare, a surreal moment that I couldn't wake up from. I was trapped, alone, and utterly defenseless. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the moment shattered. A distant sound, the approach of a police siren, pierced the stillness. The intruder's attention shifted, and in a swift motion, they vanished into the shadows. Relief flooded over me, but it was mixed with lingering fear and an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. I collapsed to the ground, shaken to my core, grateful for the chance to escape the nightmare that had unfolded before my eyes. It was a chilling encounter, a moment that would haunt my thoughts for a long time. I just got home from work, ready to unwind after a long day. It was a typical evening dinner, a little TV, nothing out of the ordinary. But then, something felt off. It was a subtle sensation, a tingling unease that settled at the base of my neck. As I moved through the house, a peculiar sensation of being watched crept over me. Every creak, every whisper of sound seemed amplified, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to find someone there. But the house was empty, or so I thought. Then, I noticed it, the faintest traces of movement in the corner of my eye, shadows flickering where they shouldn't be. At first, I brushed it off, attributing it to tiredness or imagination running wild. But as the evening wore on, the feeling persisted, nagging at me like an itch I couldn't scratch. I did a double take at my bedroom door, which seemed slightly ajar, just a fraction more than I'd left it. My pulse quickened, and a chill ran down my spine. I was certain I had closed it before leaving this morning. Doubt gnawed at my thoughts, but I didn't want to alarm myself unnecessarily. I scanned the room, looking for any signs of disturbance. Everything appeared in place, yet an inexplicable sense of intrusion lingered. I shrugged it off, attributing it to stress, but my instinct screamed otherwise. Nightfall arrived, and the uneasy feeling persisted, amplifying with each passing hour. I could almost sense a presence, as though someone was lurking in the shadows just beyond my line of sight. The night was quiet, almost too quiet. Every creak of the house sounded amplified, and the silence was stifling. I felt like a prey being watched by a predator, the sensation gnawing at the edges of my sanity. As I made my way to bed, a flash of movement caught my eye, subtle, fleeting, but unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat, and a chill swept over me. I scanned the room, searching for the source of the movement, but found nothing. Yet the feeling of being observed persisted, intensifying with each passing second. I struggled to shake off the growing unease as I settled into bed, pulling the covers tightly around me. Every shadow seemed to take on a life of its own, morphing into potential threats in my mind. I was on edge, my senses heightened, attuned to the slightest sound. Then, a faint rustle, barely audible, but enough to snap me out of my uneasy trance. I lay frozen, listening intently, straining to discern any movement in the darkness. There it was again, the sound of someone or something moving somewhere nearby. Fear gripped me, and I fumbled for the bedside lamp, my hand trembling. But as the room flooded with light, there was nothing. No one was there, just the empty room and the eerie silence that wrapped around me like a suffocating shroud. I dismissed it as my imagination playing tricks on me, yet the feeling of being watched persisted, a suffocating weight on my chest. The night stretched on, each minute feeling like an hour. As I drifted closer to sleep, a flicker of movement, a shadowy figure darting across the room. My heart hammered in my chest, and I bolted upright, adrenaline surging through my veins. But when I turned on the lights, the room was once again empty. I couldn't ignore it anymore, the creeping dread that had taken root in my mind. Someone was watching me, stalking me, and the realization sent a shiver down my spine. My home, my sanctuary, now felt like a trap. The vulnerability was palpable, a sense of violation that left me utterly defenseless. I couldn't shake off the feeling that every move I made was being scrutinized, observed by an unseen intruder. With a surge of adrenaline, I searched the house, every corner, every nook, but found no one. My nerves were frayed, and the fear of the unknown gnawed at me like a relentless predator. I contemplated calling the police, but what would I say? There was no concrete evidence, just this suffocating feeling of being surveilled. I felt isolated, trapped within the walls of my own home. I huddled in the corner of my room, clutching a baseball bat for a false sense of security. The hours dragged on, every noise sending my heart racing. I was teetering on the edge of paranoia, haunted by the presence I couldn't see. And then, in the dead of night, I heard it, a sound, unmistakable and chilling. Footsteps, soft but distinct, echoing through the hallway. Panic surged through me, my mind racing with scenarios of imminent danger. I was paralyzed by fear, consumed by the realization that the intruder was real, closer than ever before. The sound drew nearer, closer to my door, and my breaths came in shallow, rapid bursts. The doorknob rattled, a jolt of terror shooting through my body. Someone was on the other side, trying to gain entry. Fear constricted my chest, my thoughts racing as I contemplated my next move. I had no escape, nowhere to run. My mind raced through options, all leading to a dead end. The door rattled violently, and I braced myself, ready for the worst. And then, silence, a deafening silence that filled the room. The sound ceased, and the dread lingered in the air like a heavy fog. I stayed huddled, trapped in that moment of terror, unsure if the danger had passed or if it was just the calm before the storm. The night wore on, and the tension in the air was palpable. I dared not move, not even to turn off the lights. Exhaustion battled with fear, and I fought to stay alert, unsure of what awaited me in the darkness. Dawn broke, the light filtering through the windows, bringing a sliver of relief. I cautiously emerged from my barricaded corner, the adrenaline rush slowly waning. The house was still, undisturbed, but the unsettling feeling lingered. I searched every inch, every room, but found no trace of the intruder. It was a night of terror, an encounter with an unseen threat that left me questioning my safety, my sanity.